March 9, 1942. Dawson Creek, British Columbia. The temperature on the wooden railway platform is 35 degrees below zero. A harsh, howling wind sweeps down from the Arctic, carrying microscopic ice crystals that slice at the exposed faces of the newly arrived American soldiers. Stepping off the heated train cars into the pitch blackness of the northern night, the men of the United States Army Corps of Engineers are hit by a cold so profound it steals the breath from their lungs. They are standing at the absolute end of the line. Dawson Creek is a tiny frontier town, the terminus of the Northern Alberta Railway, and beyond it lies nothing but more than 1,000 miles of uncharted, unyielding wilderness. There are no roads, no supply depots, and no shelters. There is only a vast frozen jungle of dense black spruce, towering mountain ranges and bottomless bogs hidden beneath deep snowdrifts. The engineers huddle together, their heavy olive-drab wool coats offering little protection against the biting chill. Unloading their gear in the dark, they listen to the metallic clatter of heavy equipment being wrestled off flatbed rail cars. Massive 20-ton D8 Caterpillar bulldozers sit frozen on the tracks, their engine oil turned to the consistency of thick tar in the extreme cold. Mechanics build roaring fires underneath the steel bellies of the tractors, just to thaw the oil pans enough to crank the engines. When the huge diesel motors finally roar to life, they belch thick plumes of black smoke into the pristine night air, the sound shattering the silence of a wilderness that has remained untouched for millennia. These men have been given an impossible order. They are to build a military supply highway through one of the most hostile environments on the planet, connecting the contiguous United States to the remote territory of Alaska. And they have been told they must do it in less than a year. To understand the sheer desperation of this mission, one must look back to the morning of December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m. The devastating Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor crippled the United States Pacific Fleet and thrust the nation into a global war it was scrambling to fight. In the chaotic aftermath of the attack, military planners in Washington stared at the map of North America with mounting dread. Alaska, a vast and sparsely populated territory, was dangerously exposed. It jutted out into the northern Pacific, pointing directly toward the Japanese Empire. Military strategists realized with terrifying clarity that Alaska was essentially an island. There were no land routes connecting it to the lower 48 states. Every single bullet, ration, and soldier sent to defend Alaska had to travel by ship along the vulnerable Pacific coast where Japanese submarines were already prowling. If the Imperial Japanese Navy launched an invasion of Alaska, they could establish a foothold on the North American continent, putting the cities of the Pacific Northwest within range of enemy bombers. The threat was not theoretical. It was a looming existential crisis. On February 11, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized the immediate construction of the Alaska-Canada Highway, soon to be known as the ALCAN. For over a decade, politicians and civilian surveyors had debated building such a road, arguing endlessly over the route, and concluding that it would take at least 5 years and millions of dollars to complete, assuming the unforgiving terrain could be conquered at all. The United States Army was given no such luxury of time. The War Department ordered the Corps of Engineers to punch a pioneer road through the wilderness by the onset of the next winter. They had roughly 8 months. Commanding the operation was Brigadier General William M. Hogue, an incredibly driven and demanding officer who had earned his reputation as a brilliant tactician and engineer. Hogue arrived in Dawson Creek and immediately realized that the environment was an enemy far more dangerous than any human adversary. The terrain before him was a nightmare. The planned route would stretch from Dawson Creek northwest through the Yukon Territory and end in Delta Junction, Alaska. It crossed 3 major mountain ranges, bridged hundreds of freezing rivers, and sliced through millions of acres of dense subarctic taiga. The taiga was a treacherous landscape. It was a dense, tangled forest of black spruce trees growing so closely together that a man could barely squeeze between them. Underneath the trees lay the real terror of the North. It was a geological phenomenon known as permafrost. For thousands of years, the ground just a few feet below the surface had remained permanently frozen. Above this layer of ice sat a thick blanket of decaying moss, lichen, and organic matter. During the winter, this top layer froze solid, supporting heavy equipment. But Hogue knew that in a few short months the spring thaw would arrive. When the temperature rose, the top layer of organic matter would melt, but the water would have nowhere to drain because of the solid ice just below it. The entire forest floor would transform into a bottomless, soupy bog known as Muskeg. General Hogue gathered his regimental commanders in a drafty wooden shack in Dawson Creek. Looking at the crude maps spread across the table, Hogue delivered a blunt assessment. He told them that they had to move thousands of men, their bulldozers, their fuel, and their food over the frozen winter trails before the spring thaw trapped them. If they did not cross the frozen Peace River and the hundreds of miles of ice-locked swamps by April, they would be completely cut off from their supply lines, stranded in the middle of nowhere without food or fuel. The race against the sun began. The 35th Engineer Regiment was ordered to move out first, acting as the vanguard. Their objective was Fort Nelson, roughly 300 miles to the north. To get there, they had to drive their heavy equipment over a rudimentary winter trail that local fur trappers used. The cold was brutal and unrelenting. Temperatures routinely plummeted to 40 and 50 degrees below zero. At these temperatures, the very properties of metal and rubber changed. Axes swung against frozen spruce trees shattered like glass. The rubber tires of the supply trucks froze solid and snapped into pieces. If a soldier touched bare metal with an ungloved hand, his skin would instantly freeze to the steel, and pulling it away would rip the flesh to the bone. The engineers quickly learned to keep the engines of their bulldozers and trucks running 24 hours a day. If a motor was shut off, the block would freeze solid in minutes, and it would take hours of dangerous work with a blowtorch to thaw it out again. Private First Class Walter Strick, a bulldozer operator from Chicago, found himself living a surreal existence in the driver's seat of his D8 Caterpillar. Driving through the endless darkness of the northern winter, he pushed into the dense wall of spruce trees. The technique was brutal and effective. The bulldozer would simply drive straight into the trees, the massive steel blades snapping the trunks like matchsticks. The noise was deafening, a continuous barrage of cracking wood, roaring diesel, and the squealing of frozen steel tracks. Behind the lead bulldozers came the rest of the regiment, sleeping in canvas tents pitched directly on the snow. To stay warm, the men chopped mountains of firewood, stuffing it into small potbelly stoves that turned the center of the tent into an inferno while the edges remained freezing cold. Men would fall asleep exhausted, only to wake up a few hours later with their blankets frozen firmly to the ground by their own condensed breath. Rations consisted of canned meat and hardtack, but the cans froze solid. The men had to chop open the metal tins with bayonets and heat the frozen blocks of hash over open fires just to eat. By early April, the Vanguard had successfully crossed the thick ice of the Peace River and pushed north toward Fort Nelson. But the victory was short-lived. The days began to lengthen, and the sun grew warmer. The temperature crept above freezing, and the great spring thaw commenced. The transformation of the landscape was rapid and catastrophic. The thick ice on the rivers began to groan and crack, breaking apart into massive, jagged flows that smashed into the wooden pontoon bridges the engineers had hastily erected, sweeping them away in terrifying torrents of churning water and ice. The solid white plains of snow melted, revealing the dark, deceptive surface of the Muskeg. What had been a frozen highway just a week prior suddenly dissolved into a bottomless swamp of freezing mud. It was an impenetrable, rotting jungle. The mud was alive. It sucked at the boots of the soldiers, pulling them off their feet. Heavy trucks sank up to their axles, then up to their floorboards, and finally up to their engine hoods. Even the mighty 20-ton D8 bulldozers were not immune. An operator would be driving along what looked like solid ground, only to suddenly pitch forward as the Muskeg gave way, swallowing the entire machine in seconds. The men had to use thick steel cables and two other bulldozers just to drag the sunken machines out of the muck. The engineering manual provided no solutions for building a road over a bottomless swamp of melting permafrost. Whenever the bulldozers scraped away the top layer of moss and muck to find a solid foundation, they only exposed more of the frozen ice below to the warm sun. The ice would melt, creating more water, and the mud would get deeper. It was a vicious cycle of destruction. The engineers realized that they could not fight the Muskeg by digging into it. They had to float the road over the top of it. They resurrected an ancient engineering technique known as a corduroy road. It required staggering amounts of manual labor. Thousands of men were sent into the dense, swampy jungle with nothing but hand axes and crosscut saws. They chopped down millions of small black spruce trees. These trees were laid side by side, tightly packed across the width of the muddy trail, creating a floating wooden mat. Over this mat, the bulldozers would dump a thick layer of gravel and dirt hauled from nearby riverbeds. The dense mat of logs distributed the weight of the heavy trucks and insulated the permafrost below, keeping it frozen. It was a slow, agonizing process. Every single mile of road over the Muskeg required thousands of trees to be felled by hand, stripped of their branches, and hauled through knee-deep mud to the roadbed. As the spring turned into the summer of 1942, the physical environment launched a new offensive against the exhausted men. The harsh winter cold was replaced by a sweltering, humid heat. The temperature soared to 90 degrees. The vast tracts of standing water in the Muskeg became the perfect breeding ground for insects. It was an entomological nightmare. Clouds of mosquitoes, black flies, and microscopic biting gnats known as no-see-ums descended upon the work crews in numbers that defied comprehension. The insects were so thick they formed gray clouds that blocked out the sun. They flew into the men's eyes, ears, noses, and mouths. The bite of the black fly tore small chunks of flesh from the skin, leaving bloody welts that swelled and burned. The men were issued heavy netting to wear over their helmets and thick, foul-smelling liquid repellent, but the sweat and exertion of felling trees quickly washed the repellent away. Soldiers worked in heavy wool shirts buttoned tight to the collar, wearing thick leather gloves despite the suffocating heat, simply to keep the bugs off their skin. Men were driven to the brink of insanity by the constant buzzing and biting. Some soldiers had to be physically restrained and sedated after suffering nervous breakdowns from the relentless torment of the insects. Adding to the psychological toll was the phenomenon of the midnight sun. By June, the men were working at a latitude where the sun barely set. There were 20 hours of harsh daylight, followed by 4 hours of twilight. The endless day completely destroyed the men's natural circadian rhythms. General Hoge and his subordinate commanders capitalized on the light, instituting a brutal work schedule. The men worked in 2 massive 12-hour shifts. The bulldozers never stopped. The chainsaws never stopped. Men lost track of days and weeks. They worked until they were physically incapable of standing, collapsed in their canvas cots for a few hours of fitful sleep in the bright twilight, and woke up to do it all over again. Exhaustion led to dangerous mistakes. Bulldozer operators hallucinated, seeing phantom buildings and people in the dense timber, sometimes driving their machines off steep embankments. The pressure from Washington was immense, and it was about to get worse. On June 3, 1942, the Japanese military launched a carrier-based airstrike on the American naval base at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. Days later, Japanese troops stormed ashore and occupied the remote Alaskan islands of Attu and Kiska. The nightmare scenario had materialized. The enemy was on North American soil. The news of the invasion spread through the engineer camps like wildfire. The men in the mud and the mosquitoes suddenly understood exactly why they were there. They were no longer just building a road. They were building a lifeline for territory under active enemy attack. The War Department sent urgent telegrams demanding more speed. The road had to be finished. The fate of Alaska depended on it. To meet the impossible deadline, the Army deployed more troops, including 3 regiments of African-American soldiers. The military was heavily segregated at the time, and black soldiers were routinely relegated to menial labor and denied the opportunity to serve in combat or frontline engineering roles. The deployment of the 93rd, 95th, and 97th Engineer General Service Regiments to the ALCAN project was a significant shift, though they were treated with blatant prejudice. They were issued the oldest, most battered equipment. They received hand-me-down bulldozers that constantly broke down, worn-out shovels, and inadequate winter clothing. Their white commanding officers were often resentful of their assignments, viewing the command of a segregated unit as a career dead end. Despite facing the dual hardships of a brutal environment and systemic institutional racism, these African-American engineers performed miracles. The 95th Engineers were assigned to one of the most difficult and miserable stretches of the route. They were tasked with bridging the Sakani Chief River. The Sakani Chief River was a violent, rushing torrent of freezing meltwater, over 300 feet wide, cutting through a steep valley. The standard military pontoon bridges had already been smashed to splinters by the force of the river and the massive logs sweeping down the current. The only way across was to build a permanent, heavy timber trestle bridge. The white officers commanding the sector estimated it would take 3 weeks. The men of the 95th Regiment took it as a personal challenge. Lacking enough heavy machinery, the men waded waist-deep into the freezing, rushing water. They carried massive, freshly cut spruce logs on their shoulders. They used crude, hand-cranked pile drivers to pound the heavy wooden pilings deep into the rocky riverbed. The men sang work songs to keep the rhythm of the heavy iron hammers falling in unison. The physical exertion was staggering. Men slipped on the slick rocks, plunging completely underwater, only to be hauled up by their comrades, shivering uncontrollably and put right back to work. Working around the clock in the endless daylight, the 95th Engineers completed the massive trestle bridge over the Sakani Chief River in an astonishing 84 hours. When the first heavy supply truck rolled safely across the sturdy timber deck, the entire regiment erupted in cheers. Their monumental achievement shattered the prejudiced expectations of the top brass and proved that the segregated regiments were among the finest engineering units in the United States Army. As the road pushed further north and west, the terrain shifted from flat, swampy Muskeg to the towering, jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Colonel Albert L. Lane, an energetic and fearless officer, commanded the troops blasting their way through the rocky passes. Here, the mud was replaced by solid granite and treacherous cliffs. The engineers had to carve a ledge out of the sides of mountains where a single mistake meant a plunge of hundreds of feet into the rocky gorges below. The work was incredibly dangerous. The men used pneumatic drills to bore deep holes into the solid rock face, packing them tight with dynamite and highly volatile ammonium nitrate. Warning sirens would wail across the valleys, followed by earth-shattering explosions that sent tons of jagged rock raining down the mountainsides. The dust was blinding. The men worked without hard hats or safety harnesses. Bulldozer operators, known as cat skinners, would inch their machines out onto the narrow, newly blasted ledges to clear the debris. The heavy steel tracks would spin and slip on the loose rock, the outside edge of the tracks hanging out over empty space. The bravery of these operators was legendary. They trusted their lives entirely to the massive diesel machines and their own steady hands on the steering clutches. By September 1942, the seasons began to turn again. The brief, brutal summer gave way to autumn. The leaves of the aspen and birch trees turned a brilliant, fiery yellow before falling to the ground. The mosquitoes finally died off, replaced by the return of the bitter cold. The first snow flurries dusted the peaks of the mountains. The urgency reached a fever pitch. The northern crews working south from Alaska and the southern crews working north from British Columbia were closing the gap. They had been working toward each other for 7 months, separated by hundreds of miles of uncharted wilderness. Now the gap was shrinking to mere miles. The men could feel the momentum. Supply lines were stretching to their absolute limits. Trucks were driving hundreds of miles over the newly laid, rough-hewn dirt and corduroy roads, bringing diesel fuel, dynamite, and rations to the spearhead camps. The road was a jarring, bone-rattling nightmare of ruts and potholes, but it was a road. In late September, in a remote valley in the Yukon Territory, the men of the 97th Engineer Regiment were pushing north through a dense forest. Leading the charge was Corporal Rufines Sims, Jr., a black bulldozer operator from Philadelphia. Sims was an artist with a D8 Caterpillar. He could maneuver the massive machine with pinpoint precision, ripping up stumps and moving earth with relentless efficiency. For days, the men of the 97th had been listening closely. Over the roar of their own machinery, they thought they could hear a faint, rhythmic thumping in the distance. It was the sound of heavy diesel engines. It was the 18th Engineer Regiment, working their way south. The two crews were separated by a final, thick patch of spruce forest. On September 24, 1942, the noise grew deafening. The trees ahead of Corporal Sims began to shake and shudder. Suddenly, the towering spruce trees cracked and fell backward. Bursting through the timber came another massive D8 bulldozer driven by Private First Class Walter Streich of the 18th Engineers. The two massive steel beasts halted just feet apart, their engines idling loudly in the freezing air. Corporal Sims and Private Streich killed their engines. The sudden silence in the forest was deafening, broken only by the cheering of the men emerging from the tree line. The two bulldozer operators climbed down from their steel tracks, walked across the crushed pine branches, and shook hands. They had met at a small, unnamed stream. It was appropriately christened Contact Creek. The gap was closed. The impenetrable wilderness had been pierced. However, a pioneer road is not a finished highway. The connection at Contact Creek meant that a vehicle could technically travel from Dawson Creek to Alaska, but the road was narrow, incredibly dangerous, and prone to washing out. The engineers spent the next several weeks desperately widening the road, reinforcing the timber bridges, and dumping thousands of tons of gravel to ensure the roadbed would survive the coming winter. The cold returned with a vengeance. By October, the temperature was back down to 0. The mud froze solid again, which ironically made the road surface smoother and easier for the heavy trucks to traverse. Convoys of military supply trucks began rolling north, hauling anti-aircraft guns, ammunition, aviation fuel, and troops to fortify the Alaskan garrisons against further Japanese incursions. The logistical miracle had been achieved. On November 20th, 1942, 2 p.m., a formal dedication ceremony was held to mark the official opening of the ALCAN Highway. The location was Soldiers Summit, a bitterly cold, wind-swept peak overlooking the majestic Klulan Lake in the Yukon Territory. The temperature was an unforgiving 30 degrees below 0. A small crowd of military brass, politicians, and shivering engineers gathered on the frozen dirt road. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had sent a message of congratulations, praising the incredible speed and endurance of the troops. A ceremonial ribbon hastily fashioned from red, white, and blue bunting was stretched across the highway. General William Hoge stood alongside Canadian officials, their breath pluming in the freezing air. A pair of oversized scissors was produced. With a quick snip, the ribbon fell to the frozen ground. A military band, their brass instruments freezing to their lips, played a ragged but spirited rendition of the national anthems. It was a brief, freezing ceremony, lacking the grand pomp of a major victory, but it meant everything to the men who had bled and frozen to make it happen. The construction of the ALCAN Highway stands as one of the most astonishing engineering feats in military history. In just 8 months, over 10,000 American soldiers and officers, alongside civilian contractors, had carved a 1,500-mile road through a completely unforgiving subarctic jungle. They had crossed more than 200 rivers and streams, moved millions of tons of earth, and battled temperatures ranging from 90 degrees above zero to 60 degrees below. They fought blinding blizzards, bottomless mud, swarms of insects, and their own physical limitations. They suffered frostbite, exhaustion, and the loss of friends who perished under rolling heavy equipment or drowned in freezing rivers. The road they built fundamentally changed the strategic landscape of the Pacific War, securing the northern flank of the North American continent and ensuring a steady flow of supplies that eventually allowed American forces to drive the Japanese out of the Aleutian Islands. The legacy of the ALCAN Highway is carved into the very stone and permafrost of the North. It is a permanent testament to the sheer willpower, staggering ingenuity, and raw courage of the engineers who were told the job was impossible and who simply fired up their bulldozers, drove into the dead of winter, and did it anyway.